This is the debriefing video for the 17th of October, 2022. The joint session, which is the Board of Trustees and the Planning Commission and the Zoning Board of Appeals for a working session discussing things, finding out different people's perspectives, trying to get in alignment or at least find out where we're in misalignment. And there's a lot of different perspective on that board, both out in the world in professional settings and those types of things, and in the operations of the township, because there's administration, there's executive function, there's legislative function, there's judicial function, and they're each seeing slightly different things. So it's good. The communication is decent in general, but it's good, I think, to get everyone together for full-on human look each other in the face and say what you want to say type of communication. I think it's very useful, and it was good. This was a 2.5-hour meeting, decent amount of attendance, quite a few people there. This was our schedule. I'm obviously not going to go over a ton of things in detail because it's a 2.5-hour discussion among a lot of people. But the first thing on overregulation, a basic sentiment, I'm going to go kind of through some of what I'm pulling from this meeting on directions to head and those types of things, and some of what just emerged. And these will continue to change over time because there'll have to be certain changes will have to be discussed at the board level, certain changes at the planning commission level, and certain things through both. So there'll be ongoing discussions, all right? But it's a good place to start some of these. The idea of overregulation, I'm kind of heading in the direction of what would be useful here is specifics. Looking at the specifics of rolling back some of that regulation, which I think is 100% true. ZBA variance request patterns, not really seeing any patterns there. That those things seem to have resolved decently well. Master plan process. This was a bigger discussion on which way should we go about this. And I think it's a decent idea that we could do an RFP for proposals, and then in some of the proposals, there might be things that we didn't think about. I also think it's a very good idea to do a full survey, a full mailing survey, along with an electronic version that people can register for, and we'll have to look at specifics, details of how to set that up, and then how to correlate it, right? How to process that information, because you're going to have probably some overlap there, so it's going to have to be checked. And then I think Todd's idea is solid too about you can parse it out a little bit. What can we do in-house to lower it so it's not tens of thousands of dollars, multiple tens of thousands of dollars? Try to limit that to the extent that we can. And I mean, it was done 5 years ago, right? It's not like it was a decade ago. I think it would probably be reasonable to do something more extensive every 10 years and something more in-house every 5 years, something like that over a long period of time. Not that there would probably ever be that consistency in a government. But nevertheless, and then we can outsource those things that it would make sense to outsource, but keep in-house the things that it would make sense to keep in-house. So I think something like that is reasonable. And then, like Marvin was mentioning, to get people a time frame that they can expect on these things moving forward. Next, the ARPA fund usage recommendations, and basically a decent amount of support for roads, decent amount of support for the building, the roof and that type of thing. I know a couple of the board members mentioned that they like the idea of trying to think about it in percents of what's going to what, which makes a lot of sense. Decent amount of discussion about the boat ramps, but I mean, realistically, their big bills can take years of permitting, and the one on Twin Lake, which is the one people are mostly interested in, which, we have five ramps we could take care of on 5 different lakes, so you can add up to millions of dollars very quickly on that. And the one at Twin Lake is a county park, so it's county land, so it has to go through them. So there's no good way to pursue that, which is, even though I've talked to the county a bunch of times about it and that type of thing, so I have pursued it lightly, at least had the conversations, but there's no good place for the township to move on something like that. Next, utility buildings without homes. This didn't really come to a solid direction on it, I don't think. It was that I think Jesse made good points that there's not a huge need for it here. I think there's decent points on that it could be allowed. But he's also making the point that you're going to have the places that get abandoned and stuff because that's how that works, right? You see that a ton up north, and I think that's very true. And I was talking about, so my personal sentiment, my personal view is I would just roll that way back, right? But that doesn't mean my personal view applies in the government role and in the given societal context. And I think that's probably true with this one. So I think probably discussion that will continue, but maybe some other discussions in front of it that are more important, and we can probably get more alignment, more common ground on. So we hit, as we're moving into camping without a home, and between utility buildings without homes and camping without a home, we talked about tiny homes. And there was a decent amount of debate over this. And I think the society is heading in the direction of tiny homes, trying to make housing more accessible. And there's traditionally been a lot of restrictions on this type of thing, for the last several decades. And to a large extent, what is happening with these types of things is you start making it illegal to be poor, right? There's nowhere for poor people to be because they can't afford to be anywhere, which is a major societal issue. Like, that's not going to work out good, especially if you start, if you look into the work of Peter Turchin and things like that and how societies collapse, it's a good direction to go, right? But I won't dive into the details of that. But nevertheless, by moving this amount of minimum square footage smaller, some people are making very nice tiny homes, and you can fit a lot in, right? Casey was making that with the cabins that they have in 360 some square feet. I think she was saying you can have quite decent house, which if you arrange it right, which seems like a very small amount of room, but realistically, I lived in a 500 square foot apartment in Texas and had plenty of room. We had extra room. It was me and a girlfriend and a dog, and it was completely fine. And so I think that's reasonable. And then I think, Tracy was talking about this of having like in-law quarters, something like that, as a separate building on the same parcel. And accessory dwelling units would be the normal term for this as it's coming about. And I think that's reasonable to pursue as well, which is similar to tiny homes. And then it was brought up, like Craig was saying, it would make sense to have it separate for tiny homes going on their own parcel versus like a tiny home park. And I think that is true. I think that makes sense in the way we've been pursuing it now, because we had the one tiny home park discussion. They ended up going in the city of Muskegon, but they were out here. They presented in front of the Planning Commission, and basically it was going to be treated for the Planning Commission with a site review process and approval and that type of thing, like a campground. Then that gets into camping without a home, right? And similar issues, but a little more intense, a little more divisive. It was brought up, like Renee was bringing up, that people wouldn't want to pollute their own land and this type of stuff, except that is extremely common. It is extremely common. And then we get a lot of complaints on this type of thing, but we also get a lot of requests for it, right? So it's a strong movement in both directions, which is difficult. But I think if the main concerns are the water and septic, and this is basically what people came to, and it'll obviously be an ongoing thing, but if the main concerns are having water and septic, and people can park an RV and have water and septic that they have installed and it has been approved for health regulations, then maybe camping with some sort of camper or RV on your own land, if you have water and septic hookups, makes sense. So something like that. Next, we had the Twin Lake Traffic Circle. Decent amount of discussion here. The point that I had to bring it around to is like, what is the township going to do? It's an MDOT road. It's a state road. There's always going to be a safety study being done on the road, basically. Is something going to move on it toward a traffic circle or toward a light? Maybe eventually, but there's no good point of leverage. There's no good spot for the township to move on that type of process. Next, beautification of Whitehall Road and M120, and the general sentiment out of the discussion is just probably don't add in more regulations of trying to make people's frontage and the form, the way it looks from the road, more difficult to comply with. Next, we had reduced site plan review to primaries, which just makes sense of getting together with Steve, the zoning administrator, and getting a nice checklist where the checklist will actually be in the packets for the planning commission, so they know we got this, we got this, we got this. We don't have this, but it's not applicable in the situation, and we're still waiting on this. It's something, some sort of checklist that for the planning commission to review, which goes into the next thing is an instruction packet or to-do list for site review for people. And we have somewhat of both of these. All right, we just need to get a little better on the operation of it so that the communication is working a little better, basically. And those were recently brought up. These things, I think about them in general over the years, but over the last couple of months I collected them. So they were smaller things that were brought up in the Planning Commission more recently, so they'll just be handled there. Next, we had fruit trees on township land. I think the sentiment there is good, is solid in its accessibility to food, especially for the lower classes, for poorer people. The issue becomes with township management or government management of food resources like that. And so that gets it moves in a dangerous direction of a fascist or a communist type of system and setup. And there's danger in the direction of crony capitalism too. In my one article, Why Authoritarian Governments Hate Small Farms, I consider each of those, a fascist, a communist, and a crony capitalist type of setup, and consider them each bad, right? And so you move in a dangerous direction there. I don't mind some minor things there, but if you get into something more extensive, you're adding on to the work that the township has to kind of try to maintain. And the township probably hasn't done that well in at least decades in keeping up with what it has. And so that becomes a real struggle. And even if you have a volunteer organization, which I haven't had any proposals from volunteer organizations or those types of things to set up a community garden, which I think would be reasonable to consider. But you have to think, well, if no one does it, if no one actually coordinates it, if no one actually works it, are we just having the township maintain it then, or are we just letting it fall into disrepair? Which direction are we going on something like that? It's something that ideally should be worked out with some sort of plan beforehand. And I would like to see a plan, some sort of proposal from whoever wants to volunteer in the first place for those types of things. Next, we went over food sovereignty, or the right to food. A few things here. In general, a decent amount of support. I think there will be a decent amount of debate and discussion as this rolls out, because it is, so that's my first thing on the list. And it's a decently political thing, but I think it is very important as one of the foundations. I try to work on, it's important that I work on operations here at the township, right? Things have to be managed, things have to be done. But it's also important that I take some of my time and work on the foundations of civilization. And so the right to food is very important. Food sovereignty, I think, is a great step in that direction. And the enforcement, which we hit on a little bit later, which is due process, right? And so these types of things are what if I'm going to take time to really work on something for a few years, which is usually what it takes to really accomplish something decently large, then it's those types of things. It's also important, we're trying to tackle, I'm coordinating with Nate, the head of maintenance and grounds, to work on getting the street signs over the next couple of years better, because they've not been systematically taken care of in I don't know how many years, but a long time, right? And so decades. And so it's nice to do something like that, but that it's not really a foundation of civilization. It's just very convenient if you can drive around and see street signs and know where you are. But I want to tackle some of these foundational things that are very important, and food sovereignty is one of those. My basic idea being that we'll enact an ordinance, a general code ordinance, over probably the next couple of months, and then next fall, probably next November, go for it being on the ballot for an actual vote. Next, we have the township organizational structure, and I just went over here. I've been going over for probably approaching a year, somewhere in there. It's quite a while, either way. Going over what the township organizational structure actually looks like, and part of why it doesn't function well is because your highest power is the township board, and that is a political structure, right? It doesn't really make sense, like from a company standpoint. I think I have one, yeah. So it looks like that. And so that top line, that highest boss being the board, looks like this hydra, I've been calling it. But you get these differences in personality, you get these disagreements over big things, small things, whatever it may be. And so the major authority in the township is disagreeing with itself, right? That's why I called it schizophrenic for a while, but people didn't like that metaphor. So I think the idea of a hydra, especially when you draw it like that, it looks kind of like a hydra, a multi-headed thing, makes a lot of sense. And so just went over that, so we can have some understanding. Next, enforcement ordinance. And we're on our second version of a resolution for doing the enforcement ordinance. Due process is one of the main foundations of civilization. In its modern form, you can really trace it back to the Magna Carta. Magna Carta in the 1215 version, the original version, has a type of due process in there. The phrase itself is used for the first time in a Magna Carta, I think in the 1300s. And so it's just very important that there is a process for enforcing whatever may be. And so I would like to see us move forward with putting that into an actual ordinance, right? The resolution process, I think, was important at first, because if we had to adjust something, which we did, we had to make one major adjustment on that would be not smooth if it was an ordinance, right? You'd have some sort of little disaster for a while. Instead, having it as a resolution, testing it out, it didn't work great to do the automatic administrative appeals. And so rolled that part back, and now I think we can move forward with having an ordinance in the general code and the zoning over that. Next, we have motorsports approval. And this is brought up because there's a difference in how the motorsports approval is than every other approval in the book. And I'm sure it was a political thing in the past at some point. And it would make sense to have that one way or the other since the board has the authority on that. You could even skip the planning commission, or you could have it so that everyone that does a review can appeal it to the board if they wanted, or that just everyone has the final ruling is in the planning commission. It would make sense to align that with the way all of the other processes work for other businesses, which I think makes sense. And finally, we had the other category, which I had one major thing, and that is the township contracting with the village for zoning administration services. And we went over that, and that was generally supported and makes a lot of sense. I think with the specifics, right? The specifics in a contract end up being very important. With the specifics that I'm working out in the contract, makes a lot of sense, had a decent amount of support. And we had a few public comments. I didn't actually write myself the notes on the public comments and the discussions that I had about the health of Westlake afterwards with the individual that was public commenting is what's coming to my mind, but that's not actually the comment that was made in the meeting. But a decent amount of stuff. Obviously, it was like 2 hours, 29 minutes, 22 seconds, I believe is the full video. So 2.5 hour meeting, a lot of good discussion in there. And if people are more interested in, they can hear the different opinions that came out at the various times. But I think a lot of good points made, a lot of good out of hearing and seeing those different perspectives for everyone. So if anyone has anything, feel free to reach out, of course, anytime. Direct line is area code 231-332-6700, or email supervisor@daltontownship.org. Until next time, this is Jeff signing off.